Section 7 of The Psychology of Peoples by Gustave Le Bon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Oxenhandler. Book 1, Chapter 2. How Institutions, Religions, and Languages are Transformed. The superior races are as powerless as the inferior races to transform suddenly the elements of their civilization. Contradictions presented by the peoples which have changed their religions, languages, and arts. The example of Japan. In what respect these changes are only apparent. The profound transformations undergone by Buddhism, Brahmanism, Mahometanism, and Christianity, according to the various races by which they have been adopted. The variations undergone by institutions and languages, according to the race that adopts them. That the words which in different languages are considered to correspond represent very dissimilar ideas and modes of thought. Impossibility for this reason of translating certain languages. Why in books of history the civilization of a people sometimes seems to have undergone profound changes. Limits of the reciprocal influence of different civilizations. We have shown in a previous book that the superior races are wholly unable to induce inferior races to accept their civilization or to thrust it on them. Taking one by one the most powerful means of action at the disposal of Europeans, education, institutions, beliefs, we have proved their absolute inefficacy as means of changing the social state of the inferior peoples. We have endeavoured to establish that since all the elements of a civilization correspond to a certain well-defined mental constitution created by heredity in the course of the long past, it is impossible to modify them without changing the mental constitution of which they are the outcome. Such a task is beyond the power of conquerors, and can only be accomplished by the lapse of centuries. We have also shown that it is only by a series of successive stages analogous to those traversed by the barbarians who destroyed the Greco-Roman civilization that a people can rise in the scale of civilization. If it be sought by means of education to spare a people these stages, all that is done is to disorganize its morality and its intelligence and to reduce it in the end to a level inferior to that it would have reached if it had been left to itself. The arguments we have applied to inferior races are equally applicable to superior races. If the principles we have set forth in this work are correct, it ought to be clear that the superior races are also incapable of suddenly transforming their civilization. They too require time and need to traverse successive stages. If the superior peoples seem at times to have adopted beliefs, institutions, languages, and arts differing from those of their ancestors, they have done so in reality only after having slowly and profoundly transformed them so as to bring them into touch with their mental constitution. History appears to contradict on every page the preceding proposition. It offers us frequent examples of peoples changing the elements of their civilization, adopting new religions, new languages, new institutions. Some peoples abandon the beliefs they have held for centuries and are converted to Christianity, Buddhism, or Mahometanism. Others transform their language, yet others radically modify their institutions and their arts. It even seems that it rests with a conqueror or an apostle to provoke such transformations, or even that they result from a mere caprice. History, however, in offering these accounts of sudden revolutions, does no more than accomplish one of its habitual missions, the creation and propagation of enduring errors. When these alleged changes are closely studied, it is soon perceived that it is only the names of things that easily vary, whereas the realities hidden behind the words continue to exist and are only transformed with exceeding slowness. To prove this assertion and to show at the same time how the slow evolution of things goes on behind denominations that remain unchanged, it would be necessary to study the elements of each civilization in the case of the different peoples, that is, to rewrite their history. I have already essayed this laborious task in several volumes. It will not be asked in consequence that I should again attempt it here. Leaving aside the numerous elements of which a civilization is composed, I shall choose but one of them as an example, the arts. Before approaching, however, in a special chapter, the study of the evolution accomplished by the arts in passing from one people to another, I shall make a few remarks respecting the changes undergone by the other elements of civilization, in order to show that the laws applicable to one of these elements are perfectly applicable to all of them, and that if the arts of the different peoples correspond to a certain mental constitution as much as to be said of their languages, institutions, beliefs, etc., which in consequence cannot change suddenly and pass indifferently from one people to another. Footnote: I shall not deal here with the case of Japan, having already treated it elsewhere, while I shall certainly return to it on a future occasion. It would be impossible to study in a few pages a question on the subject of which eminent statesmen are the victims of delusions which are shared unfortunately by certain philosophers wanting in insight. The prestige adhering to military triumphs, even though achieved at the expense of mere barbarians, still remains for many minds the criterion of the level of civilization. It is possible to drill an army of Negroes in accordance with European military principles and to teach them to handle rifles and cannon, but their mental inferiority and the consequences it involves will not be modified on this account. The varnish of European civilization boasted at present by Japan in no wise corresponds to the mental condition of the race. It is a trumpery, borrowed garment which will soon be rent by violent revolutions. End of footnote. It is more especially in connection with religious beliefs that this theory may appear paradoxical, and yet it is precisely in the history of these very beliefs that the best examples are to be found in proofs that it is as impossible for a people suddenly to change the elements of its civilization as for an individual to alter his stature or the colour of his eyes. Nobody, doubtless, is ignorant that all the great religions, Brahmanism, Buddhism, Christianity, or Mahometanism, have provoked conversions en masse among entire races who have seemed to adopt them on a sudden. However, when a closer study is made of these conversions, it is soon observed that what the peoples have more especially changed is the name of their old religion, and not their religion itself, and that in reality the adopted beliefs have undergone the transformations necessary to bring them into touch with the old beliefs they have replaced, and of which in reality they are a mere continuation. The transformations undergone by beliefs in passing from one people to another are often indeed so considerable that the newly adopted religion has no longer any visible relationship with that of which it has kept the name. The best example is offered us by Buddhism, which, after having been transported into China, has become so unrecognizable that the learned took it at first to be an independent religion, and were a long time before they recognized that this religion was merely Buddhism transformed by the race that had adopted it. Chinese Buddhism is in no sort the Buddhism of India, itself very different from the Buddhism of Nepal, which in turn is sufficiently distinct from the Buddhism of Ceylon. In India, Buddhism was a schism from Brahmanism which preceded it, and from which at bottom it differed to no very great extent. In China it was also a schism from earlier beliefs to which it is closely related. The rigorous proof that is possible in the case of Buddhism is forthcoming as well in that of Brahmanism. The races of India being extremely varied, it was easy to presume that under identical names they would have extremely different religious beliefs. Doubtless all the Brahmanic peoples regarded Vishnu and Shiva as their principal divinities, and the Vedas and their sacred books. But of these fundamental gods the religion has retained but the name, and of the sacred books but the text. Around these central and common features have grown up innumerable cults in which are found, according to the races, the most varied beliefs: monotheism, polytheism, fetishism, pantheism, the worship of ancestors, of demons, of animals, etc. Were the religions of India to be judged solely by what is found concerning them in the Vedas, not the least idea would be obtained of the gods and beliefs of the immense peninsula. The title of the sacred books is venerated by all the Brahmins, but there survives in general nothing of the religion taught by these books. Islamism itself, in spite of the simplicity of its monotheism, has not evaded this law. It is a far cry from the Islamism of Persia to that of Arabia and that of India. The Hindu, essentially a polytheist, has contrived to render polytheistic the most monotheistic of beliefs. For the 50 millions of Hindu Mahometans, Mahomet and the saints of Islam are scarcely more than new gods added to thousands of others. Islamism has ever been unable to establish in India that equality of all men which elsewhere was one of the causes of its success. The Mussulmans of India, like the other Hindus, practice the system of castes. In the Deccan, among the Dravidian populations, Islamism has become so unrecognizable that it can scarcely be distinguished from Brahmanism. Indeed, it would not be distinguished from it at all, but for the name of Mahomet and for the mosque where the Prophet, become a god, is worshipped. It is not necessary to go as far as India to observe the profound modifications undergone by Islamism in passing from one race to another. It suffices to consider our great possession, Algeria. It contains two very different races, Arabs and Berbers, both of them Mussulmans. The Islamism of the former is far removed from that of the latter. The polygamy of the Koran has become monogamy among the Berbers, whose religion is scarcely more than a fusion between Islamism and the old paganism practiced by the race since the distant ages of Carthaginian rule. The religions of Europe themselves are not accepted from the common law which obliges beliefs to undergo a transformation in accordance with the soul of the races by which they are adopted. As in India, the letter of the dogmas fixed by the texts has remained invariable. But these dogmas are vain formulae, of which each race interprets the meaning after its own fashion. Under the uniform denomination of Christians are found in Europe veritable pagans, such as the Basque Breton who worships idols, fetishists such as the Spaniard who adores amulets, polytheists such as the Italian who venerates as very different divinities the Madonnas of each village. Were this study to be prosecuted further, it would be easy to show that the great religious schism of the Reformation was the necessary consequence of the interpretation of one and the same religious book by different races. Those of the North, wishing to discuss their belief, regulate their life themselves, and those of the South, having remained far behind from the point of view of independence and the philosophic spirit, no example would be more convincing. These are facts, however, the development of which would lead us beyond our scope. We shall have to deal still more briefly with the two other fundamental elements of civilization, institutions and languages, because it would be necessary to enter into technical details that wholly surpass the limits of this work. What is true in the case of beliefs is equally true in that of institutions. These latter cannot be transmitted from one people to another without undergoing transformation. Not wishing to multiply examples, I beg the reader merely to consider how greatly, in modern times, the same institutions imposed by force or persuasion on different races have been transformed, though retaining identical names. I shall demonstrate the fact in a forthcoming chapter in connection with the different regions of America. Institutions are the outcome in reality of necessities on which the will of a single generation of men can have no action. For each race and for each phase of the evolution of that race, there are conditions of existence, sentiments, thoughts, opinions, hereditary influences, which imply certain institutions and do not imply others. The label a government bears is of very slight importance. It has never been accorded a people to choose the institutions which appear to it to be the best. Should some rare stroke of chance allow a people to choose its institutions, it will be unable to keep them. The numerous revolutions, the successive changes of constitution effected by the French during the last 100 years constitute an experience which should long since have settled the opinion of statesmen on this point. I believe, moreover, that it is scarcely elsewhere than in the obtuse brain of the masses and the narrow minds of some few fanatics that the idea can persist that important social changes are to be brought about by legislative acts. The only useful role of institutions is to give legal sanction to changes which manners and public opinion have ended by accepting. Institutions are moulded by these changes, but they are not in advance of them. The character and thought of men are not to be modified by institutions. It is not by institutions that a people is rendered religious or sceptical, or that it is taught to conduct its own affairs without incessantly demanding of the state that it shall forge it a chain. I shall not dwell on the question of languages any more than on that of institutions, and shall confine myself to drawing attention to the fact that even where a language is fixed by writing, it is necessarily transformed in passing from one people to another, a truth that renders so absurd the idea of a universal language. Doubtless the Gauls, in spite of their immense numerical superiority, had adopted the Latin language less than 2 centuries after their conquest. But they were quick to bring the newly adopted tongue into harmony with their needs and the logic peculiar to their bent of mind. Modern French is the final result of these transformations. It is impossible for different races to speak the same language for any length of time. The chances of conquest, the interests of its commerce may doubtless bring a people to adopt another language in the place of its mother tongue, but after the lapse of a few generations the language adopted will have been entirely transformed. The transformation will be the more thorough in proportion as the race from which the language has been borrowed is the more different from that which has borrowed it. Dissimilar languages are always certain to be met with in countries inhabited by different races. India affords an excellent example in point. The great peninsula being inhabited by numerous different races, it is not astonishing that 240 languages should, according to the linguistic authorities, be spoken in it, some of them differing more from each other than do French and Greek. These 240 languages do not include some 300 dialects. The widest spread among these languages is quite modern, since it has only existed for 3 centuries. It is Hindustani, a language formed by a combination of the Persian and Arabian spoken by the Mussulman conquerors and Hindi, one of the principal tongues of the invaded regions. Conquerors and conquered soon forgot their primitive language, exchanging it for a new language adapted to the needs of the new race produced by the interbreeding of the various peoples brought together. I cannot dwell longer on the matter and am obliged to confine myself to indicating the fundamental ideas. Were I able to enter into the necessary developments, I would go further and would say that where people are different, the words considered among them as corresponding represent modes of thinking and feeling so far apart that in reality their languages have no synonyms, and real translation from one language into the other is impossible. How wholly this is the case will be understood by observing how, in the same country and among the same race, the same word corresponds in the course of centuries to quite dissimilar ideas. Old words represent the ideas of the men of the past. Words which at their origin were the signs of real things soon have their meaning altered in consequence of changes in ideas, manners, and customs. Recourse is still had to these time-worn signs, for it would be too difficult to change them, but there is no correspondence between what they represented at a given moment and what they signify at the present day. In the case of peoples at a great distance from us, and whose civilizations were without analogy with our own, translations can only give words absolutely deprived of their real primitive sense, words, that is, evoking ideas in our minds which have no relation to those they formerly evoked. This phenomenon is especially striking in connection with the ancient languages of India. The ideas of the Indian people are indistinct, their logic has no relationship with our own, and their words have never had that precise and definite meaning which the lapse of centuries and the turn of our minds has ended by giving words in Europe. There are books, the Vedas for example, the translation of which, though it has been vainly attempted, is impossible. Footnote. Talking of the numerous attempts to translate the Vedas, an eminent Indian scholar, Mr. Barth, remarks, quote, "All these various and at times so contradictory investigations have one result. They demonstrate how impossible it is for us to make a translation, in the true sense of the word, of the Vedas." Unquote. End of footnote. It is difficult enough to penetrate the thought of the individuals with whom we live, but from whom we are separated by certain differences of age, sex, and education. To penetrate the thought of races on whom the dust of centuries has accumulated is a task no scholar will ever succeed in accomplishing. All the learning it is possible to acquire merely serves to show the complete uselessness of attempts of the kind. Brief and slightly developed though the preceding examples be, they suffice to show how profound are the transformations peoples effect in the elements of civilization they borrow. The importance of the elements borrowed often appears to be considerable, because the change in names is in fact sudden. This importance is in reality very slight. In the course of centuries, thanks to the slow labours of generations and in consequence of successive additions, the borrowed element ends by differing greatly from the element from which it originally took the place. History, which takes note more especially of appearances, pays but little attention to these successive variations, and when it tells us, for example, that a people adopted a new religion, what we at once represent to ourselves is not at all the beliefs really adopted, but the religion such as we know it at the present day. It is necessary to study these slow adaptations with the utmost closeness in order to understand their genesis and to detect the differences that separate words from realities. The history of civilizations is thus composed of slow adaptations, of slight successive transformations. If these latter appear to us to be sudden and considerable, it is because, as in geology, we suppress the intermediate phases and only consider the extreme phases. In reality, however intelligent and gifted a people be supposed to be, its capacity for absorbing a new element of civilization is always very restricted. The brain cells do not assimilate in a day what it has taken centuries to create, and what is adapted to the sentiments and needs of organisms that differ from one another. Only slow hereditary accumulations allow of such assimilations. Further on, when we come to study the evolutions of the arts among the most intelligent of the peoples of antiquity, the Greeks, we shall see that many centuries were necessary before the rude copies of Assyrian and Egyptian models were left behind, and after long successive stages, those masterpieces were produced which are still the admiration of humanity. It must also be observed that all the peoples which have succeeded one another in history, with the exception of a few primitive peoples such as the Egyptians, the Chaldeans, have had little to assimilate beyond the elements of civilization which constitute the inheritance of the past. Elements they have transformed in accordance with their mental constitution. The development of the world's civilizations would have been infinitely slower, and the history of the various peoples would have been one eternal recommencement, if they had been unable to profit by the materials elaborated before their time. The civilizations created some 7,000 or 8,000 years ago by the inhabitants of Egypt and Chaldea have served as a store of materials to which all the nations have had recourse in turn. The arts of Greece owe their origin to the arts created on the banks of the Tigris and the Nile. The Grecian style gave birth to the Roman style, which, under the action of Oriental influences, has given birth to the Byzantine, Roman, and Gothic styles, styles which vary according to the genius and age of the peoples among whom they flourish, but styles that have a common origin. What we have just said in connection with the arts is applicable to all the elements of a civilization, institutions, languages, and beliefs. The European languages are derived from a mother tongue which was spoken in the past on the central plateau of Asia. French law is an offshoot of Roman law, itself the offshoot of earlier codes of law. The Jewish religion proceeds directly from the Chaldean beliefs. Associated with Aryan beliefs, it has become the great religion which for nearly 2,000 years has exerted its sway over the Western peoples. Our sciences themselves would not be what they are were it not for the slow labour of centuries. The great founders of modern astronomy, Copernicus, Kepler, and Newton, are the lineal descendants of Ptolemy, whose books retained their influence down to the 15th century, while Ptolemy descends through the Alexandrian school from the astronomers of Egypt and Chaldea. We thus get a glimpse, in spite of the formidable gaps of which history is full, of a slow evolution of our knowledge which takes us back through the successive ages and empires to the dawn of those ancient civilizations which modern science is attempting to link with the primitive times when humanity had no history. But if the source is common, the transformations, progressive or regressive, which each people effects according to its mental constitution in the elements it borrows are very varied, and it is the history of these transformations that constitutes the history of civilization. We have just seen that the fundamental elements of which a civilization is composed are peculiar to each people, that they are the result, the expression of its mental structure, and that in consequence they cannot pass from one race to another without undergoing the most profound changes. We have also seen that the extent of these changes is marked on the one hand by linguistic necessities, which oblige us to employ the same words to designate very different things, and on the other hand by historical necessities, which lead us to take into account only the extreme forms of a civilization, and to neglect the intermediary forms by which they are connected. When studying in the next chapter the general laws of the evolution of the arts, we shall be able to show with still greater precision the succession of the changes which take place in the fundamental elements of a civilization when they pass from one people to another. Section 7.